At 8 p.m. on a cold November night in 1971, a commercial airliner was flying quietly above the Pacific Northwest when a passenger handed a flight attendant a note, one that claimed he had a bomb. The man appeared calm, polite, even quiet, but when the attendant read the note, she froze. The message was simple, terrifying, and impossible to ignore. "Miss, I have a bomb." When she returned to his seat, the man quietly opened his briefcase. Inside were rows of red cylinders and wires, something that looked frighteningly real. Then he calmly made his demand, $200,000 in cash and 4 parachutes waiting when the plane landed. Hours later, after the ransom was delivered, the aircraft took off again into the darkness, this time with only a handful of people on board and a hijacker preparing for something unbelievable. Somewhere high above the forests of Washington state, the rear staircase of the aircraft opened, and the man history would call D.B. Cooper stepped into the storm and vanished forever.
Welcome to Unimaginable True Crimes. Here, we expose the unimaginable, one case at a time. On the afternoon of November 24th, 1971, the day before Thanksgiving, a quiet man walked into Portland International Airport carrying nothing but a briefcase and a carefully planned secret. He purchased a one-way ticket under the name Dan Cooper for a short flight from Portland, Oregon to Seattle, Washington. The flight he selected was Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305, a routine 30-minute trip that would soon become one of the most famous mysteries in aviation history. At first glance, there was nothing unusual about him. Witnesses later described a polite, middle-aged businessman with calm manners and a quiet voice. He wore a dark suit, a white shirt, and a thin black tie, an outfit common among businessmen in the early 1970s. Passengers boarding Flight 305 saw only another traveler taking his seat near the back of the aircraft. Northwest Orient Flight 305 prepared for departure just before sunset. To the passengers boarding that evening, it looked like any other short commuter flight across the Pacific Northwest. Inside the cabin, travelers settled into their seats. Some flipped through newspapers, others chatted quietly while waiting for the short flight to Seattle to begin. The quiet man, calling himself Dan Cooper, sat near the rear of the plane, smoking a cigarette and observing the cabin with an expression that revealed almost nothing. Witnesses later said he appeared composed, almost relaxed. Nothing about his behavior suggested the extraordinary crime he was about to commit. The aircraft slowly pushed back from the gate, engines humming to life as evening shadows stretched across the runway. Inside the cockpit, the flight crew followed routine procedures, completely unaware that the flight would soon become one of the most famous mysteries in aviation history. At 2:50 p.m., Flight 305 lifted smoothly into the gray November sky, beginning what should have been an uneventful 30-minute journey. Passengers relaxed as the aircraft climbed through the clouds. Most expected to be in Seattle before they finished their drinks. The man known as Cooper ordered a bourbon and soda, lighting another cigarette while quietly watching the clouds pass outside the window. Everything about his behavior suggested patience. He appeared to be waiting for the right moment. Flight attendants moved through the cabin offering drinks and snacks, unaware that the quiet passenger was studying every movement. Outside, the Pacific Northwest stretched below, dense forests, winding rivers, and miles of rugged wilderness. Those forests would soon become the stage for one of the most mysterious disappearances in modern history. Back in the cabin, Cooper quietly reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He glanced toward the aisle, making sure no one else was watching. Then he calmly motioned for the nearest flight attendant to come closer. To her, it looked like a routine request from another passenger, but the piece of paper he handed her carried a message that would instantly change everything. At first, she slipped the note into her pocket without reading it. Then the man leaned closer and spoke quietly. "Miss," he said calmly, "you'd better read that note." Curious, the attendant unfolded the paper, and in that moment, the calm atmosphere inside Flight 305 began to unravel. The message was brief but chilling. It claimed the man beside her had a bomb and that he intended to use it if his demands were not met. For a moment, she wondered if it was a joke. Then, Cooper slowly opened his briefcase. Inside were wires, batteries, and red cylindrical objects. The message was suddenly very clear. The quiet passenger seated in row 18 was not joking. He was hijacking the plane, and he had already planned every step. Within minutes, the crew would be quietly informed, but no one on board yet understood they were witnessing the beginning of the most famous unsolved hijacking in American history.
The flight attendant moved quickly but quietly toward the cockpit, clutching the note in her hand and trying to keep her voice steady. Inside the cockpit, the pilots listened carefully as she explained the situation, one passenger claiming to have a bomb. The crew immediately contacted air traffic control, relaying the message that their aircraft had just been hijacked. Back in the cabin, the man calling himself Dan Cooper remained calm, sipping his drink while waiting patiently. When the flight attendant returned, he calmly repeated his demands. He wanted $200,000 in cash. He also demanded 4 parachutes, 2 main chutes and 2 reserve chutes. And he wanted a fuel truck waiting in Seattle to refuel the aircraft after landing. If the demands were not met, he warned, he would detonate the bomb. Authorities on the ground immediately began assembling the ransom. Meanwhile, Flight 305 continued circling the skies near Seattle. Inside the cabin, passengers still believed they were experiencing only a minor delay. The crew had been instructed not to alarm anyone on board. Outside, law enforcement officers rushed to prepare the ransom money. Bundles of $20 bills were carefully counted and photographed. Investigators recorded the serial numbers of every bill. Authorities hoped the marked bills might one day help identify the hijacker. Back on the aircraft, Cooper remained polite and surprisingly calm. He even offered to pay for his drink. But the tension in the cockpit continued to rise. After nearly 2 hours in the air, the plane finally received permission to land. Seattle-Tacoma International Airport prepared for the most unusual landing in its history. The aircraft touched down just after dark. Police and FBI agents waited nearby but kept their distance. The ransom money was delivered, along with the 4 parachutes he demanded. Passengers were quietly released from the aircraft. Most of them had no idea how close they had come to danger. But Cooper was not finished yet. He ordered the aircraft refueled. Then he gave the pilots new instructions. They were to fly south toward Mexico, and they were to keep the aircraft flying low and slow. Just after 7:30 p.m., the plane took off again. Only a few crew members remained on board. And somewhere inside the aircraft, Cooper prepared for the next phase of his plan. No one on board could yet imagine what he was about to do. Because somewhere above the forests of Washington, he intended to disappear, and history would remember the name he used that night, D.B. Cooper. Before we continue, if you've been following the story so far, please take one moment to support the channel. Like this video, turn on notifications, and subscribe to Unimaginable True Crimes. As the aircraft climbed into the dark skies over Washington state, law enforcement agencies across the region were already mobilizing. The FBI had been notified that a hijacked plane carrying a bomb was now flying south. Within minutes, the case would become one of the most complex aviation investigations in American history. Meanwhile, Northwest Orient Flight 305 continued flying through storming skies. Inside the aircraft, the hijacker remained calm and methodical. He instructed the crew to lower the aircraft's altitude and to maintain a slow speed of just 200 miles per hour. These were unusual flight conditions, but perfect for parachuting. At the same time, the FBI secretly ordered military aircraft into the sky.
2 Air Force fighter jets lifted off to track the hijacked plane. But the pilots struggled to see the aircraft in the darkness. Cloud cover and heavy rain made tracking nearly impossible. Back inside Flight 305, Cooper began preparing his escape. He tied the ransom money around his waist. Then he ordered the remaining flight attendants to move to the cockpit. From that moment on, the hijacker was completely alone in the cabin. Somewhere over southern Washington, the aircraft continued flying through rain and darkness. Inside the cockpit, the crew waited anxiously for the next command. Suddenly, the crew felt something unusual. A warning light illuminated on the control panel. The aircraft's rear staircase had been lowered. The crew realized Cooper was preparing to jump. Moments later, the aircraft suddenly shifted upward. The shift lasted only seconds, but it was enough. Somewhere below the plane, a lone parachute descended into darkness. The man known as D.B. Cooper had just jumped from the aircraft, and he was carrying $200,000 in ransom money. Below him stretched miles of forest, rivers, and rugged mountains. No one knew exactly where he had landed, and no one had seen him jump. When the plane finally landed in Reno, Nevada, Cooper was gone. FBI agents rushed on board, but the rear cabin was empty. The parachutes were gone, and the ransom money had vanished with him. The hijacker had disappeared into the night. The manhunt began immediately. Helicopters scanned the forests, ground teams searched rivers and mountains, but there was no sign of Cooper. Within hours of the junk, the FBI launched one of the largest search operations in American aviation history. Investigators quickly calculated the possible drop zone somewhere in the forests of southern Washington. Helicopters were dispatched before sunrise to begin scanning the wilderness below. Search teams moved through miles of rugged terrain, but the Pacific Northwest landscape made the search extremely difficult. Heavy rain had fallen the night Cooper jumped. Strong winds could have pushed the parachutist miles from the expected drop zone. Still, investigators believed they would find something: a parachute, a bag of money, even a body. But the forest revealed nothing. Days passed, then weeks, still no sign of the mysterious hijacker. The FBI began investigating the identity behind the name, because Dan Cooper was clearly an alias. The name that would become famous, D.B. Cooper, was actually a mistake made by reporters. Investigators interviewed every passenger and crew member. From their descriptions, a composite sketch was created. The image showed a calm, middle-aged man with dark hair and sunglasses. The sketch was distributed across the country. Soon, tips began pouring in. Hundreds of possible suspects were reported. Many seemed promising at first, but one by one they were eliminated. The hijacker appeared to have vanished completely. Then, investigators examined the aircraft itself. They collected fingerprints from the cabin, but the evidence was frustratingly limited. The hijacker had left almost nothing behind. No parachute, no money, not even a clear landing site. Yet investigators refused to give up, because somewhere the hijacker had landed, and somewhere the ransom money still existed. For years, investigators searched for answers. Then, nearly a decade later, something unexpected happened. A young boy was digging in the sand along the Columbia River. Suddenly, he uncovered something strange buried beneath the sand. Bundles of old $20 bills. The serial numbers matched the ransom from the Cooper hijacking, and the mystery of D.B. Cooper suddenly became even more complicated.
Nearly a decade after the hijacking, investigators believed the trail had gone completely cold. Search teams had combed thousands of square miles of wilderness across Washington state, but they had found no parachute, no body, and no trace of the hijacker. Then, in February of 1980, something unexpected happened. An 8-year-old boy named Brian Ingram was digging in the sand along the Columbia River. The location was a quiet area known as Tenna Bar, north of Portland. While digging near the riverbank, the boy uncovered several bundles of decaying cash.
At first, the discovery looked like nothing more than damaged old bills, but when authorities examined the money, they realized something extraordinary. The serial numbers matched the ransom money from the Cooper hijacking. Nearly $6,000 from the original ransom had been found. The discovery shocked investigators across the country because it proved that at least part of the ransom had survived. And it raised a new mystery. How had the money ended up buried along the riverbank? The location was miles away from where investigators believed Cooper had jumped, which meant the money must have traveled there somehow. Some investigators believed it had washed downstream over time. Others believed someone had buried it intentionally. The condition of the bills made the puzzle even stranger. The bundles appeared to have been buried for years, but they were found neatly stacked together, a detail that did not easily match the river current theory. Despite extensive analysis, investigators could not determine exactly how the money arrived there. But the discovery proved something important. The Cooper mystery was far from solved. Meanwhile, the FBI continued examining the evidence left behind on the aircraft. One item stood out: the black clip-on tie the hijacker had removed before jumping. For years, the tie remained one of the most important pieces of physical evidence. Decades later, forensic scientists began examining it using modern technology. Microscopic particles were discovered embedded within the fabric. Those particles suggested Cooper may have worked in an industrial environment. Some of the materials were linked to aerospace manufacturing, which led investigators to consider a new possibility. Perhaps Cooper had worked in the aviation industry, someone familiar with aircraft design and flight procedures. Someone who knew that the Boeing 727 had a rear staircase, a staircase that could be lowered during flight, a feature unique among commercial aircraft at the time. That knowledge suggested the hijacking had been carefully planned. The hijacker had demanded parachutes. He had ordered the aircraft to fly low and slow, and he had selected the only aircraft capable of making such a jump possible. But investigators also discovered something puzzling. The parachute Cooper used may not have been the best one available. In fact, one of the parachutes he took could not even be steered, which raised questions about how experienced he really was, because an expert skydiver likely would have chosen a different parachute. That detail divided investigators into two camps. Some believed Cooper was an experienced professional. Others believed he was simply an extremely lucky amateur. Meanwhile, the FBI continued examining suspects. Hundreds of names were investigated over the years. Some suspects were former military paratroopers. Others had aviation or engineering backgrounds. Each seemed promising at first, but none could be definitively linked to the crime. Fingerprints failed to match. Handwriting comparisons revealed no clear suspect, and the hijacker's true identity remained hidden. Over time, the Cooper case became one of the most famous unsolved crimes in America. The story captured the imagination of investigators and the public alike, because the mystery contained an almost unbelievable possibility that a man had hijacked a plane, collected a fortune in ransom, jumped into the night sky, and vanished forever. But investigators still debated one critical question: did Cooper survive the jump? Or did the harsh wilderness claim him that night? The weather had been freezing, the winds had been strong, and the terrain below was extremely dangerous. Yet no body was ever discovered, no parachute was found, and most of the ransom money was never recovered, which left investigators with an unsettling possibility that the man known as D.B. Cooper may have escaped, perhaps living quietly somewhere under a different name, or perhaps his true identity was lost forever. Either way, the mystery of D.B. Cooper was only becoming more legendary.
By the late 1970s, the investigation into the hijacker known as D.B. Cooper had generated hundreds of leads, but none had solved the mystery. Over time, investigators identified several suspects who seemed unusually promising. One suspect was a former military paratrooper with a background in explosives.
Another suspect had worked in aviation engineering. Each suspect seemed to match some part of the hijacker's skill set, but investigators could never prove that any of them were Cooper. The case slowly turned into a puzzle filled with missing pieces. Even the hijacker's escape remained difficult to explain. Some experts believed the jump had been carefully planned. Others argued that the conditions that night made survival extremely unlikely. Cooper had jumped into freezing temperatures over rugged wilderness while carrying a heavy bag filled with ransom money. Yet investigators could not ignore one critical fact. No parachute was ever found, no body was ever discovered, and most of the ransom money never appeared again, which raised a chilling possibility. What if Cooper had actually survived and disappeared into a completely new life, living quietly somewhere under a different name? Some investigators believed that was exactly what happened. Others remained convinced the jump ended in tragedy, that the wilderness claimed the hijacker shortly after he landed. But the evidence was never strong enough to prove either theory, which left the Cooper case suspended between two possibilities: a man who died in the wilderness, or a man who escaped with one of the boldest crimes ever committed. Either way, the hijacker had achieved something extraordinary. He vanished without leaving a trace, and the mystery surrounding his identity only grew stronger, because after decades of investigation, the man known as D.B. Cooper had never been identified, which left investigators with a haunting question. Who was the man who stepped out of that plane, and where did he go after the jump? Those questions remain unanswered to this day, because the identity of D.B. Cooper has never been confirmed, and perhaps it never will be. But the mystery continues to fascinate investigators and historians alike, because sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones that refuse to end. In the decades following the hijacking, the legend of D.B. Cooper continued to grow. Books were written, documentaries were produced, and countless theories were proposed. Some portrayed Cooper as a criminal mastermind. Others imagined him as a mysterious outlaw who outsmarted the authorities. But for investigators who worked the case, the mystery remained deeply frustrating, because the evidence suggested that somewhere the truth still existed. Somewhere someone knew who Cooper really was, and perhaps somewhere the missing ransom money still remains hidden. In 2016, the FBI made a major announcement. After 45 years of investigation, the agency officially suspended active efforts to identify Cooper. Resources would instead be focused on more recent cases. But the Cooper mystery itself was never truly closed. New tips still occasionally reach investigators, and new theories continue to emerge, each attempting to answer the same haunting question. Did the hijacker survive the jump? Or did the storm and wilderness claim him that night? Half a century later, no one can say for certain. But one fact remains undeniable. The man known as D.B. Cooper committed one of the most daring crimes in aviation history, and then vanished into the night sky. If this story held your attention, like the video, subscribe to Unimaginable True Crimes, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next investigation. Your support helps these stories reach people who need to hear them. In the summer of 1988, a young woman went for a routine bicycle ride along a quiet road in New Mexico. She never returned. Days later, a mysterious photograph would surface, one that many believe could hold the key to what happened. In our next investigation, we examine the disappearance of Tara Calico.